For years, these films were dismissed as exaggerated. Their ideas felt excessive, impractical, even irresponsible. Audiences assumed no society would ever function by removing personal judgment and replacing it with fixed processes. Those ideas did not disappear. They were adjusted, simplified, and reframed as efficient solutions. Over time, they were introduced quietly, without spectacle or debate. Eventually, these systems became ordinary. They stopped feeling extreme. They now operate continuously, in the background of everyday decisions. One enemy of the state, 1998. When authorization is determined by data correlation rather than human review, judgment becomes a function of system alignment. In such systems, legitimacy depends on aggregated signals, not individual assessment. Released in 1998, Enemy of the State introduced the idea that access and action could be validated through interconnected data systems. At the time, this concept was dismissed as exaggerated. The belief that authority could be exercised based on data linkage rather than direct evaluation appeared implausible. The idea suggested that decisions could be justified through convergence of signals. Human judgment was treated as secondary to system confidence. This was dismissed because it assumed acceptance of actions taken without transparent reasoning. In later operational frameworks, similar approaches appeared in data-driven authorization environments. Decisions increasingly relied on cross-referenced inputs and automated validation. Human roles shifted toward managing data integrity rather than making determinations. When outcomes were contested, justification focused on system correlation rather than intent or context. Accountability diffused across infrastructure layers. Trust was placed in data coherence, not individual judgment. What once seemed extreme gradually reflected how complex systems authorized action, normalizing system-based validation over human review. 2A Scanner Darkly, 2006. When surveillance becomes an operational default, judgment shifts from assessment to observation. In such frameworks, trust is placed in continuous monitoring rather than discretionary evaluation. Released in 2006, A Scanner darkly explored systems where oversight was normalized through persistent surveillance. At the time, this idea was dismissed as impractical and invasive. The assumption that extensive monitoring could function as routine infrastructure conflicted with expectations of selective enforcement. The idea proposed that visibility itself could replace judgment. Rather than deciding when to intervene, the system maintained constant awareness, allowing responses to be triggered automatically. This was dismissed because it implied acceptance of oversight without individualized justification. In later institutional contexts, similar mechanisms appeared in environments where continuous monitoring supported operational control. Oversight systems prioritized coverage and consistency over interpretive decision-making. Alerts replaced discretion, and responses followed predefined escalation paths. When disputes arose, reference points became data logs and system records rather than personal testimony. Accountability aligned with monitoring integrity instead of individual judgment. Trust shifted toward the completeness of observation. What once appeared intrusive gradually aligned with how systems managed risk at scale, embedding judgment into surveillance infrastructure and reducing the role of discretionary evaluation. 3. Equilibrium, 2002. When behavioral regulation is enforced uniformly, judgment is replaced by automated consistency. In such systems, deviation is addressed not through evaluation, but through standardized correction. Released in 2002, Equilibrium presented a structure where compliance was maintained through system-wide enforcement protocols. At the time, this approach was dismissed as implausible. The idea that complex social behavior could be regulated without individual assessment appeared overly rigid and impractical. The central idea suggested that stability could be achieved by removing subjective interpretation entirely. Judgment was treated as a source of variability rather than value. This was dismissed because it assumed acceptance of outcomes determined without contextual understanding or discretionary review. In later operational environments, comparable models emerged in automated compliance systems. Behavioral standards were translated into measurable indicators, enabling enforcement without situational judgment. Intervention occurred when thresholds were crossed, not when intent was interpreted. Human oversight shifted toward monitoring adherence rather than evaluating circumstances. When inconsistencies appeared, They were resolved by recalibrating parameters instead of reassessing decisions. Responsibility aligned with system configuration and rule maintenance. Trust was placed in uniform application even when outcomes lacked nuance. What once seemed excessive gradually reflected how large systems ensured predictability, replacing individual judgment with automated behavioral regulation. 4. Minority Report, 2002. When decisions are validated before action occurs, judgment becomes preventive rather than evaluative. In such systems, trust is placed in predictive output instead of observed behavior. Released in 2002, Minority Report introduced the idea of preemptive decision-making driven by system-generated assessments. At the time, this concept was widely dismissed as implausible. The belief that future outcomes could justify present action conflicted with established notions of accountability. The idea proposed that consistency could be improved by intervening before deviation occurred. Individual judgment was treated as reactive and insufficient, while system output was positioned as more reliable. This was dismissed because it assumed acceptance of actions taken without observable cause. In later operational settings, similar frameworks appeared in risk-based monitoring and anticipatory controls. Decisions increasingly relied on probability assessments and forward-looking indicators. Human roles shifted toward interpreting system alerts rather than initiating judgments. When outcomes were challenged, reference points became model confidence and validation metrics. Accountability focused on adherence to predictive frameworks rather than the accuracy of individual decisions. What once appeared speculative gradually aligned with how systems managed uncertainty, normalizing trust in preemptive processes over retrospective judgment. 5. The Truman Show, 1998. When outcomes are shaped by design rather than decision, judgment shifts from response to architecture. In such systems, behavior is guided by structured environments instead of active choice. Released in 1998, The Truman Show presented a model where life trajectories were managed through operational design. At the time, this idea was dismissed as exaggerated. The assumption that large-scale outcomes could be directed without overt control conflicted with expectations of autonomy and awareness. The core idea suggested that systems could influence results by shaping conditions rather than issuing commands. Judgment was not overridden directly, it was rendered unnecessary by the environment's structure. This was viewed as unrealistic because it implied acceptance of externally guided outcomes without explicit enforcement. In later frameworks, similar logic appeared in process-driven environments where options were constrained by design. Decision-making was guided by predefined pathways, default settings, and controlled variables. Oversight focused on maintaining the system rather than intervening in individual outcomes. When deviations occurred, they were managed by adjusting the environment rather than addressing decisions themselves. Accountability aligned with system architecture, not momentary judgment. What once seemed extreme gradually reflected how structured environments guided behavior through design, replacing direct judgment with operational control. 6. Dark City, 1998. When environments are maintained through continuous systemic adjustment, judgment is no longer exercised at the moment of decision. Instead, it is embedded into the infrastructure that preserves stability. Released in 1998, Dark City introduced the idea of reality being regulated by layered control mechanisms rather than direct oversight. At the time, this concept was largely dismissed as abstract and impractical. The notion that large-scale order could be sustained through constant background intervention seemed excessive and unsustainable. The idea suggested that consistency could be achieved by removing discrete decision points altogether. Rather than evaluating individual actions, the system adjusted conditions continuously, rendering judgment unnecessary. This was viewed as unrealistic because it assumed acceptance of outcomes shaped without visible decision-makers. In later operational contexts, similar approaches appeared in systems designed to maintain equilibrium automatically. Environmental controls, adaptive infrastructures, and self-regulating frameworks prioritized continuity over situational judgment. Intervention occurred at the system level, not through individual choices. When anomalies emerged, they were treated as parameters to be corrected rather than decisions to be debated. Responsibility became diffuse, distributed across maintenance processes instead of assigned to specific actors. What once appeared implausible gradually aligned with how complex systems preserve stability by embedding judgment into infrastructure and minimizing discretionary intervention. 7 Gattaca 1997. When eligibility is determined through data scoring rather than demonstrated capability, judgment becomes a matter of threshold alignment. In such systems, access depends on metrics, not assessment. Released in 1997, Gattaca centered on the idea that participation could be governed by standardized data profiles. At the time, this was perceived as implausible. The assumption that statistical indicators could outweigh observable performance conflicted with prevailing notions of merit and evaluation. The idea proposed that systems could operate efficiently by filtering candidates through predefined criteria. Individual circumstances were treated as noise, while data consistency was prioritized. This was dismissed because it implied acceptance of exclusion without contextual review. In later institutional environments, similar mechanisms appeared through scoring models and automated screening processes. Eligibility decisions increasingly relied on aggregated indicators rather than direct evaluation. Exceptions existed, but they were managed as deviations from the norm rather than integral considerations. Responsibility shifted toward model configuration and data integrity. When outcomes were contested, reference points became scoring logic and thresholds, not individual narratives. Trust was placed in the process because it was repeatable and scalable. What once seemed like a rigid abstraction gradually mirrored how systems managed access at scale, replacing judgment with standardized evaluation frameworks. 8. Robocop 1987. When decision hierarchies are embedded directly into operational rules, authority becomes a property of the system rather than its operators. In such frameworks, outcomes are determined by compliance with encoded directives. Released in 1987, Robocop presented a model where enforcement decisions were governed by fixed rule sets. At the time, this approach was viewed as implausible. The idea that complex situational responses could be constrained by predefined priorities conflicted with expectations of human judgment. The core idea suggested that consistency could be enforced by eliminating discretion at the point of action. Judgment was not exercised dynamically, it was pre-configured. This was dismissed as unrealistic because it assumed rigid rules could adapt to unpredictable environments without continuous human oversight. In subsequent operational systems, similar structures emerged through policy engines and rule-based controls. Decision logic was codified upstream, allowing actions to be executed automatically within defined constraints. Human roles shifted toward configuring rules rather than making case-by-case decisions. When conflicts arose, resolution occurred through hierarchical rule evaluation rather than deliberation. Accountability was traced to policy design instead of individual choice. Errors were addressed by revising rules, not by questioning outcomes. What once seemed extreme gradually aligned with how automated enforcement and compliance systems operated. Trust moved away from situational judgment and toward the reliability of predefined decision hierarchies. 9. Blade Runner 1982. When identity is validated through standardized testing rather than personal recognition, judgment shifts from interpretation to verification. In such systems, legitimacy depends on measurable outputs, not contextual understanding. Released in 1982, Blade Runner introduced the idea that classification could be enforced through formalized assessment protocols. At the time, this concept was largely dismissed as implausible. The assumption that complex attributes could be reduced to testable criteria appeared overly rigid and unreliable, especially when applied at scale. The underlying idea proposed that consistency mattered more than nuance. Instead of relying on individual discretion, the system relied on repeatable procedures designed to produce clear determinations. This was viewed as unrealistic because it implied acceptance of outcomes generated without situational judgment or interpretive flexibility. In later institutional contexts, similar validation frameworks became common. Eligibility, access, and authorization increasingly depended on standardized checks rather than interpersonal evaluation. Systems prioritized uniform application over individualized consideration, reducing ambiguity but also narrowing discretion. Verification replaced interpretation as the primary function. Disputes were handled procedurally. If the test was administered correctly, the result was treated as authoritative, regardless of contextual disagreement. Responsibility aligned with adherence to protocol rather than the substance of the outcome. What once appeared as an exaggerated abstraction gradually reflected how large systems managed identity and access. Judgment did not disappear. It was embedded into the design of the test itself, transforming trust into a function of standardized evaluation. 10. Brazil, 1985. A system becomes authoritative when procedure itself replaces intent. In such environments, correct execution matters more than meaningful outcomes, and judgment is subordinated to documentation. Released in 1985, Brazil depicted a bureaucratic structure where process compliance determined legitimacy. At the time, this portrayal was seen as satirical exaggeration. The idea that procedural accuracy could outweigh human reasoning was treated as implausible and dysfunctional. The core idea suggested that systems could continue operating even when outcomes were visibly flawed, as long as procedures were followed correctly. This was dismissed because it assumed organizations would tolerate inefficiency and error if formal rules were satisfied. In later administrative frameworks, similar dynamics became common. Decision-making increasingly relied on standardized forms, predefined workflows, and validation checkpoints. Success was measured by procedural completion rather than qualitative assessment. Human judgment was confined to ensuring rules were followed, not questioning their purpose. When errors surfaced, they were addressed by refining processes rather than reconsidering decisions. Accountability aligned with compliance records instead of outcomes. Trust shifted from individuals to the integrity of the system's execution. What once appeared absurd gradually reflected how large organizations managed scale, replacing discretionary judgment with procedural certainty. 11. Rollerball, 1975. Control systems do not always rely on direct enforcement. In some structures, stability is achieved by regulating feedback, allowing behavior to adjust itself within predefined boundaries. Released in 1975, Rollerball explored a society where collective behavior was shaped through controlled systems rather than direct governance. At the time, this was regarded as exaggerated social engineering. The notion that large populations could be guided by structured feedback mechanisms rather than explicit authority appeared impractical. The idea proposed that outcomes could be normalized through repetition and containment. Individual judgment was not suppressed directly. It was rendered irrelevant by the system's design. This was dismissed because it implied that people would adapt their expectations without recognizing the controlling mechanism. Over time, similar approaches appeared in environments where behavior was influenced through metrics, incentives, and bounded choices. Systems were designed to encourage predictable responses without issuing explicit commands. Oversight shifted from decision-makers to designers of the process itself. When deviations occurred, they were absorbed as data rather than treated as challenges. Adjustment happened at the system level, not through individual intervention. Trust was placed in the feedback loop, not in personal discretion. What once seemed like a dramatic abstraction became recognizable as a scalable method of governance, where control operated indirectly through structure rather than judgment. 12. Soylent Green, 1973. When a system prioritizes continuity over explanation, individual judgment becomes secondary to operational stability. In such frameworks, outcomes are accepted not because they are understood, but because the system continues to function. Released in 1973, Soylent Green presented a society organized around resource management systems designed to prevent collapse. At the time, this approach was viewed as deliberately extreme. The idea that large-scale decisions could be maintained without transparency and still be considered legitimate conflicted with assumptions about informed consent and oversight. The central idea suggested that disclosure was optional if the system delivered consistent results. Human evaluation was treated as disruptive, introducing risk rather than clarity. This was dismissed as unrealistic because it assumed people would accept decisions without access to underlying reasoning or the ability to challenge outcomes. In later operational environments, similar patterns emerged within infrastructure designed to manage scarcity and demand. Systems increasingly emphasized output stability over participant understanding. Decision logic became abstracted, embedded within processes that delivered results without requiring explanation. Acceptance was measured by compliance, not comprehension. Responsibility diffused across layers of operation, making it difficult to locate accountability in any single role. When objections arose, they were addressed procedurally rather than substantively. The system's persistence became its own justification. What once seemed implausible gradually aligned with how complex systems maintained order by minimizing discretion and prioritizing uninterrupted function over individual judgment. 13. Logan's Run, 1976. A system that governs eligibility, access, and continuation without requiring individual assessment represents a further step in process-based trust. In such environments, outcomes are determined automatically, and discretion is intentionally removed. Released in 1976, Logan's Run depicted a society where life cycle decisions were executed by an embedded process. At the time, the concept was widely interpreted as symbolic and excessive. The idea that participation in society could be regulated entirely by predefined criteria was seen as implausible and unsustainable. The system operated without negotiation or appeal. Personal circumstances were irrelevant because the process itself was considered sufficient. This was dismissed as unrealistic because it assumed widespread acceptance of outcomes that individuals could neither influence nor override. In later institutional frameworks, similar logic appeared in eligibility systems governed by fixed thresholds and automated validation, access to services, continuation within programs, and qualification for participation increasingly relied on standardized criteria rather than case-by-case judgment. Exceptions existed, but they were framed as anomalies rather than expectations. Responsibility shifted away from individuals enforcing decisions and toward the integrity of the system itself. When outcomes were disputed, reference points became procedural compliance rather than human reasoning. Trust was placed in consistency and predictability, even when results felt detached. What once appeared as an extreme abstraction became recognizable as a scalable approach to managing complexity, where judgment was replaced not by indifference, but by design. 14. Colossus, the Forbin Project, 1970. The delegation of authority reaches a different stage when decision-making itself is transferred entirely to a system. In this model, trust is no longer placed in operators or leaders, but in continuous computational assessment. Released in 1970, Colossus, the Forbin Project, introduced the idea of strategic control managed by an autonomous system. At the time, audiences viewed this as an extreme exaggeration of automation. The belief that critical decisions could be handled without human oversight conflicted with assumptions about responsibility and accountability. The idea felt implausible because it assumed acceptance of outcomes generated without deliberation. Human judgment was portrayed as a potential liability, subject to bias and inconsistency. While the system's output was framed as inherently rational, this inversion of trust challenged prevailing norms and was widely dismissed as a cautionary fantasy rather than a viable structure. Over time, comparable frameworks appeared in operational environments where complexity exceeded human processing capacity. Decision authority increasingly shifted toward model-driven assessments, with humans positioned to monitor rather than decide. Accountability became distributed across processes, policies, and validation layers, making it difficult to identify a single decision-maker. Consistency became the primary justification. Even when outcomes were contested, adherence to system logic was treated as sufficient validation. What mattered was not whether a decision felt correct, but whether it aligned with established parameters. Authority was no longer personal, it became procedural. This transition reflected a broader acceptance of system-based trust, where reliability was defined by uninterrupted operation rather than human judgment. 15 THX 11381971. A society where decisions are not argued, reviewed, or reconsidered, but simply executed according to predefined rules. In this framework, consistency matters more than judgment, and compliance is treated as a technical requirement rather than a human choice. Released in 1971, THX 1138 emerged during a period of institutional distrust. When centralized control systems were widely perceived as oppressive and unsustainable, the film presented a world governed by automated procedures that removed discretion entirely, an idea many viewers regarded as deliberately extreme. At the time, the notion that complex social order could be maintained without individual decision-makers seemed implausible. The core idea was straightforward. If a system is consistent enough, personal judgment becomes unnecessary. Emotional variance, hesitation, and moral deliberation were framed as inefficiencies rather than safeguards. This was dismissed as unrealistic because it assumed people would accept outcomes they did not personally evaluate or influence. In later decades, similar logic appeared in administrative and operational environments. Decisions increasingly shifted towards standardized workflows, rule-based approvals, and system-generated outcomes. Human intervention was reduced not because people disappeared, but because their role changed from deciding to verifying compliance with predefined parameters. Errors were tolerated if they occurred within accepted thresholds, reinforcing trust in the process rather than in individual actors. What once seemed like an exaggerated vision of control gradually aligned with how large-scale systems optimized reliability. Judgment did not vanish. It was absorbed into infrastructure, expressed through design choices rather than moment-to-moment decisions. This idea was not rejected because it was incorrect. It arrived before systems were capable of supporting it. Early science fiction presented system-based trust as absolute, assuming infrastructure could operate without interruption or exception. At the time, this was dismissed because real-world systems were fragile. They lacked the scale, redundancy, and integration required to sustain continuous operation. Judgment remained necessary because systems could not yet absorb error or uncertainty reliably. As infrastructure matured, tolerance for imperfection increased. Systems no longer needed to be flawless. They needed to be consistent. Error became acceptable if it occurred within predictable bounds. Responsibility shifted from individuals correcting outcomes to processes maintaining stability. This transition normalized trust in systems not because they were superior, but because they were dependable. What once seemed extreme became practical once continuity outweighed precision. These systems were not adopted because they were perfect. They remained because they reduced uncertainty, standardized outcomes, and removed the need for constant judgment. Over time, reliance on process became easier than reliance on people. What began as extreme structure gradually became ordinary operation. Decisions stopped feeling imposed and started feeling procedural. Responsibility did not disappear. It was redistributed across systems designed to function without interruption. The question is no longer whether these ideas arrived, it is whether we still recognize them as science fiction. Which idea from this list feels closest to the world we already live in today?